A crystal decanter glistens under gaslight. Velvet drapes sway as laughter echoes through a London ballroom. But behind the glitter of the chandeliers, another world breeze, slow, drowsy, perfumed with laudanum and morphine. A duchess lifts a jeweled vial to her lips. A poet's eyes glaze beneath a morphine haze. A doctor scribbles prescriptions in secrecy. It is the age of refinement, but beneath its silk and etiquette runs a quiet addiction, elegant, deadly, and invisible. This is the story the empire never spoke aloud, the intoxicating underworld of its own aristocracy. They called it elegance. They called it refinement. But behind the velvet curtains and candlelit soiree, as of Victorian England, addiction had another name: fashion. In drawing rooms perfumed with jasmine and laudanum, the line between medicine and madness blurred into one long, luxurious hallucination. These were not the slums of London, nor the dark alleys of dockside opium dens. This was Mayfair, Belgravia, the world of diamonds, lace, and deception. And yet, in these polished halls, the most powerful and polished women of the empire floated through life in a haze of narcotics. Calm, compliant, and quietly enslaved. Victorian high society was obsessed with control, of appearances, of emotion, of everything. But beneath the etiquette and rigid morals, something darker pulsed. Doctors prescribed tinctures laced with morphine, laudanum, and cocaine to calm female nerves, while gentlemen carried small vials of opium, laced tonics in silver cases beside their pocket watches. The very elixirs meant to preserve composure soon became the empire's most elegant poisons. It began, innocently enough, as medicine: laudanum for sleepless nights, cocaine for melancholy, morphine for hysteria. But what started as comfort quickly became culture, a secret web of shared indulgence that bound together duchesses, poets, politicians, and painters alike. They called it the velvet habit, a quiet ritual that allowed the highborn to float through their duties, their grief, and their desires without consequence. Or so they believed. Lady Eleanor Whitby was one of them, a widow of wealth, known for her flawless reputation and immaculate attire. But behind her delicate gloves lay trembling hands. Every evening, she poured a small glass of red, not wine, but laudanum diluted in port, the fashionable cure for widow's sorrow. Soon, she began hosting intimate, recovery circles, where the city's most respectable women gathered to sip the same crimson cure. They discussed literature, morality, and dreams, unaware that the very dreams they praised were being painted by the poison within. By the 1870s, the velvet parlours of London had become silent laboratories of dependence. The addiction epidemic that had once been confined to sailors and labourers now crept through the polished halls of the elite. Yet, unlike the poor, the aristocrats never faced judgment. Their addictions were cloaked in the language of refinement. Illness, they called it. Fatigue. Delicate nerves. But the truth was that Victorian high society was teetering on the edge of delirium. A culture built on restraint, now dissolving under the weight of chemical escape. The velvet gowns and jeweled snuff boxes were not just symbols of wealth. They were props in a grand performance where pleasure was sin, and sin was secretly adored. The deeper one looked, the clearer it became. The empire's moral guardians were intoxicated. Its poets romanticized narcotic dreams. Its artists painted visions born of ether, and its doctors fed addiction with the same hand that preached virtue. The story of Velvet and Venom begins in these private rooms, where women whispered secrets between opium sips, where men hid flasks of morphine beneath their waistcoats, and where addiction, dressed in elegance, danced to the rhythm of the empire's heart. By the mid-19th century, London's upper crust had turned medicine into ritual, a performance of fragility and sophistication. Women were expected to faint gracefully, to suffer beautifully. A pale complexion and trembling hands were not signs of illness, but of refinement, and physicians, eager to please their well-paying patients, became the high priests of this narcotic faith. Doctor, Horace Bentley was one such man, a physician to the wealthy, famed for his soothing tonics. In truth, his miracles came not from science, but from the poppy and the coca leaf. His most popular prescription was a small bottle of amber liquid, its label elegantly written in looping script, Benton's elixir of calm. Within it swirled a potent mixture of opium, alcohol, and a hint of coca, enough to silence anxiety, numb pain, and seduce the senses. Lady Whitby swore by it. So did half of Mayfair. They called it the Velvet Sip, and many took it several times a day, after morning prayers, before luncheon, and again before the long, dull hours of evening conversation. It was, in every sense, the perfect Victorian drug, respectable, bottled, and bought from a doctor's hand. But beneath the silk and ceremony, something insidious grew. These women, educated, wealthy, and adored, were quietly withering. Their laughter softened, their appetites faded, and their dreams grew strange. They became dependent not just on the liquid, but on the illusion of calm it promised. Physicians, too, began to notice. Not all were blind to the spreading haze. In hushed tones, some spoke of opium habituation. Among the aristocracy, one journal in 1878 warned of creeping paralysis of will among women of refinement, but polite society refused to hear. To suggest that a duchess was an addict was to commit social blasphemy, and so the silence continued, perfumed, polished, and lethal. Meanwhile, the very same men who prescribed these poisons were often partaking themselves. Surgeons numbed their own exhaustion with morphine injections. Writers and intellectuals sipped chlorodyne before lectures. The boundaries between patient and physician blurred, replaced by a quiet complicity. In one memorable case, recorded by a private nurse, a baronet's wife was said to take 20 drops of laudanum per night to ease her nerves. When she begged her doctor to reduce the dosage, he only smiled and told her, "My dear, the empire runs on such comforts." And perhaps he was right, for by then, opiates and stimulants had seeped into every corner of Victorian life, from the nursery to the palace. Even Queen Victoria herself, it was whispered, was given tinctures of laudanum for her menstrual pains and cocaine, laced wine for fatigue. The line between medicine and addiction had vanished. The empire's pillars of strength, its doctors, its mothers, its leaders, were quietly sustained by substances that dulled both pain and conscience. But for the women of high society, there was an added cruelty. The very drugs that bound them in tranquility also bound them in silence. To speak of dependency was to risk shame. And so they smiled through their stupor, powdered their faces to hide the hollow cheeks, and floated on, graceful ghosts in silk gowns. Behind their composure, however, the first cracks were showing. Some began to vanish from social life altogether. Others grew erratic, their moods swinging wildly between euphoria and despair. Servants whispered, husbands worried, doctors wrote new prescriptions, and as the bottles multiplied on vanity tables across London, so too did the quiet dread that none dared name, that the empire's most elegant women were, in truth, prisoners of the very civility they embodied. In the grand salons of London, where gossip was an art form and secrets were currency, a new kind of gathering began to take shape. It wasn't listed in the society pages, nor spoken of in polite conversation. These were private evening salons, discreet, invitation-only circles where the city's most refined men and women met not to dance or debate, but to escape. Behind the heavy curtains of Mayfair townhouses, the glow of candles revealed an atmosphere, thick with luxury and quiet transgression. Perfumed air mingled with the scent of burning herbs and medicinal tinctures. Silver spoons and delicate glass droppers replaced champagne flutes. Here, in the safety of wealth and discretion, London's most influential figures indulged in what they called the Velvet Hour, a time of release, of blurred minds and softened emotions. These gatherings were hosted by a select few, often widows or foreign aristocrats whose homes existed just beyond the reach of scandal. Their guests were writers, painters, doctors, and statesmen, people of brilliance and burden, drawn together by the strange comfort of chemical stillness. The rules were unspoken but absolute: no questions, no judgments, no fear. The outside world, with its rigid morals and unyielding expectations, was left at the door. Within these walls, even the most disciplined souls could unravel. Lady Ada Morrill, one of the few whose letters survived, described such a night in a whispering tone. The room was soft and golden, filled with the hum of slow laughter. One could forget the weight of duty for an hour. We were dreamers, each of us. Some spoke of love, others of pain, but all beneath the same quiet haze. These salons were not dens of chaos but of melancholy. Their participants sought not wild pleasure, but release, a reprieve from the relentless decorum of high society. Many were burdened by marriages of convenience, public reputations to uphold, and emotions they could never express. What began as curiosity soon became ritual, and yet, for all their secrecy, rumors inevitably slipped through the cracks of polite society. Servants whispered of moonlit evenings where time stopped. Journalists hinted at fashionable dependencies. Even a few parliament members were rumored to partake, though never publicly. It was the era's most elegant paradox in a society obsessed with restraint. The most restrained were the ones craving escape, and so these velvet circles flourished quietly, moving between mansions, private clubs, and even artist studios in Bloomsbury. But the beauty of the gatherings was deceptive. Beneath the laughter, the tremors began, hands shaking slightly as the body adjusted to its nightly comfort. Some guests required stronger doses. Others lingered longer than they should. A few simply vanished from the gatherings altogether, confined to nervous retreats in the countryside. By the 1880s, these secret circles had become an unspoken institution of high culture, the drawing rooms of quiet desperation, and within their walls, a question began to grow, murmured only in the final hours of the night. Are we seeking freedom, or fleeing from it? London was a city obsessed with appearances. Every silk glove, polished boot, and measured phrase served a single purpose: to maintain the illusion of control. To falter, to reveal weakness was social ruin. And so, as dependency crept through the upper class, it was disguised behind impeccable manners and shining decorum. A duchess could not be seen as ill, only delicate. A gentleman was never unwell, merely overtired. The polite vocabulary of the Victorian elite became a language of concealment. What might today be recognized as symptoms of addiction were then wrapped in poetic excuses: melancholy nerves, feminine faintness, or creative exhaustion. Or behind closed doors, doctors played their part in preserving the illusion. Medical confidentiality, after all, was a tool of protection, and reputation was currency. The aristocracy's physicians were not just healers. They were gatekeepers of image. They arrived in carriages at discreet hours, carrying black leather cases that held both remedies and secrets. One such physician, Dr. Alexander Parry, kept meticulous records of his patients, though he never named them. His notes, discovered decades later, tell a haunting story. Her ladyship requests a larger dose, citing sleeplessness. Advised moderation, request ignored. Patient displays tremors, denies dependency. Husband unaware. It was a quiet epidemic sustained by silence. Husbands ignored their wives' fading health to avoid scandal. Mothers passed on soothing syrups to daughters as tokens of maternal wisdom. Dinner guests noticed the glassy eyes, the slow speech, and politely pretended not to. The media, too, looked away. Newspapers that thrived on tales of factory riots or colonial wars rarely printed a word about what was happening in the drawing rooms of the powerful. Respectability was a shield. What was tolerated in the slums as vice became in palaces a matter of privacy. Yet, traces of truth appeared in art. Writers began to weave cryptic references into their stories. Characters who floated through life in languid detachment, Women who slept too often, men who found beauty in numbness. Painters captured pale faces illuminated by unnatural calm, the melancholy of excess disguised as elegance. This duality, the facade and the decay beneath, became the essence of the era. The Victorians built their empire on structure, hierarchy, and moral certainty, yet within that order thrived the very chaos they condemned. Addiction became invisible not because it was rare, but because it was dressed in gold and lace. One could stand at a grand ball, music echoing from the string quartet, and not know that half the glittering crowd relied on tinctures and powders to endure the night. Behind every smile, perhaps there was a quiet ache, dulled by chemistry, preserved by secrecy, and still the empire moved forward. Trade routes expanded, industry roared, the British flag fluttered across continents, while at home, its finest citizens fought invisible battles behind velvet curtains. The gilded mask held firm, but masks, no matter how beautiful, eventually cracked. While the drawing rooms of London whispered in secrecy, another world, equally refined yet far bolder, began to explore this hidden intoxication in plain sight. The Victorian art scene, vibrant and rebellious, transformed the era's quiet dependence into something almost divine. For the poets, painters, and dreamers of the time, the same substances that dulled the pain of the upper class became muses. Tools to escape, to feel, and to create beyond the boundaries of reason. They called it artistic surrender. To them, it wasn't addiction, it was transcendence. Writers like Thomas de Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge became the unintentional prophets of this new philosophy. De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater revealed not just indulgence but imagination, painting the poppy as a doorway into the mind's secret chambers. Coleridge's dreamlike verses, flowing, fragmented, and otherworldly, carried the unmistakable echo of altered perception, and their influence spread. By the mid-19th century, London's bohemian undercurrent was thriving. Within candlelit rooms in Soho and Chelsea, young painters discussed the spiritual value of pain, the poetry of despair, and the colours that only appeared after a dose of calm. They believed that to create art for eternity, one must first dissolve the boundaries of self. Among them were the pre-Raphaelites, artists who painted beauty as something tragic and alive. Their subjects, pale women with wistful eyes, clutching flowers that seemed to wilt in their hands, mirrored the era's quiet obsession with both beauty and decay. Their works glimmered with a strange melancholy, as though the brush itself trembled with longing. For many artists, these substances became a sanctuary from the rigidity of Victorian morality. They offered freedom, not the political kind, but the freedom of thought, of emotion, of vision unchained by propriety. What the aristocracy used to silence their discomfort, the artists used to amplify their feeling. The lines between genius and fragility blurred. Some believed that creativity required suffering, that brilliance came only to those who dared to stand at the edge of reason. And in their pursuit of inspiration, many quietly surrendered to the same dependence they once thought gave them wings. By the late 1800s, Paris and London were exchanging more than ideas, they were trading temptations. Cafes and studios across Europe became havens for this new kind of artist, men and women who saw intoxication as philosophy. The term bohemian became fashionable, and behind it lay a life of passion, exhaustion, and unspoken cost. Not all survived it. Letters, diaries, and sketches found years later spoke of moments of clarity and regret, of visions that faded too soon, of muses that turned to ghosts. For every poem that reached immortality, there were 100 voices silenced by excess. Yet, history remembers the beauty, the melancholy portraits, the fevered poetry, the strange stillness of a civilization both terrified and fascinated by its own reflection. In this tension, between brilliance and ruin, the Victorian artist found truth. They painted it in oils, wrote it in ink, and lived it in whispers. It was the age's cruelest irony. The same substances that soothed the pain of the privileged also fed the flames of its greatest art. By the 1880s, the silence that had long protected the Victorian elite began to tremble. What had once been a private indulgence, a hidden ritual among the privileged, started to spill into public view. London, ever the watchful city, had begun to whisper. Servants talked, apothecaries muttered, and the first stories began to appear in discreet corners of newspapers, never naming names, but always hinting. A certain lady of title, one column wrote, has lately fallen into a peculiar lethargy of the nerves. Another warned of tonics too frequently prescribed to the nervous classes. The upper class was terrified. Respectability was everything, and scandal was poison. The great irony, however, was that the very substances they feared to be exposed for were still sold openly in chemists' windows, adorned with elegant labels and claims of healing. Soothing syrup, leadies, comfort drops, tincture of tranquility. Every bottle promised refinement and relief, never ruin. But society's illusions were beginning to crack. The deaths of a few prominent figures began to raise uncomfortable questions. A celebrated socialite in Bath was found lifeless after a night of restoratives. A respected physician quietly left the city after his private ledger was discovered, revealing that half of his patients were receiving the same narcotic mixtures, regardless of their ailments. Rumors spread through parlors like perfume, impossible to trace, impossible to contain. The very women who once flaunted their glass vials now hid them in sewing boxes or between the pages of prayer books. Doctors became more cautious, issuing coded prescriptions, while chemists learned to mix their medicines with discretion. For the press, this new fascination was irresistible. Sensational novels appeared, stories of doomed duchesses, corrupted gentlemen, and secret societies bound by their indulgence. The public devoured them. Behind the fiction, everyone knew there was truth. The line between gossip and fact blurred. The scandal reached its most dramatic form in the trial of Dr. Algernon Wells, a fashionable London physician accused of indiscriminate prescribing. The case revealed a shocking truth. His patient list included aristocrats, politicians, and even a bishop. Though he was quietly acquitted, the damage was done. The whispers had become shouts. Yet, what truly unsettled society was not the moral outrage. It was recognition. These were not criminals or vagrants. They were the symbols of civilization itself. The duchesses, the poets, the lords, all revealed to be just as vulnerable, just as human, as those they once pitied. And still, the problem grew. Attempts at reform failed, for every new law met resistance from the powerful. The empire depended on the very trade that fueled its secret addictions. The opium fields of India, the chemists of London, the shipping routes of the East, all were woven into Britain's prosperity. To condemn the habit publicly would have been to condemn the empire's foundations. And so, the upper class doubled down on its silence. They withdrew further behind their curtains, even as their world began to rot from within. It was the beginning of an unraveling, one that would soon expose not just individuals, but the moral contradictions of the entire Victorian age. The empire's heart, it turned out, was not made of iron or industry. It was fragile, trembling, and quietly addicted to its own illusion of control. At the turn of the 20th century, Shanghai was not just a city, it was a fever dream. Neon signs glowed above opium dens and gambling halls, and rickshaws rattled through the streets, where Western ambition and Eastern decadence collided. Known as the Paris of the East, it was a city of contradictions, of missionaries and smugglers, aristocrats and addicts, poets and prostitutes. The courtesans were its brightest jewels and its deepest tragedies. They lived in the flower houses, luxurious brothels where music, poetry, and opium intertwined into nightly rituals of seduction. These women were more than mere entertainers. They were performers of emotion, trained in the art of illusion. A single glance, a soft laugh, A poem recited by candlelight could earn them fortunes, or ruin. Many of them were brought into the trade as young girls, sold by impoverished families to madams who promised refinement and wealth. In truth, it was gilded captivity. They were educated in calligraphy, literature, and music, not to free themselves, but to enchant men who could never love them. The opium pipe was their constant companion. In the dimly lit chambers, ivory smoke curled around silk robes as the courtesans drifted between conversation and dream. For them, opium was more than a vice. It was escape, comfort, and performance. Their pale faces, half hidden by smoke, seemed ethereal, like ghosts who danced for the living. Western visitors to Shanghai often described the courtesan houses with fascination and disgust. To them, these women represented everything mysterious about the East: beautiful, dangerous, unknowable. Yet behind those painted faces lay stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and addiction that no foreign journalist ever wrote. In the 1920s, the flower houses stood at the heart of Shanghai's nightlife. Their walls had seen everything, from whispered political secrets to forbidden romances between warlords and foreign bankers. The women who lived there knew the power of silence. They were confidants, spies, and survivors in a world that offered them everything except freedom. By the end of each night, when the last guest staggered out and the music faded, the courtesans would retreat to their private rooms. There, the glamour slipped away. They would light another pipe, watch the smoke twist into fragile shapes, and whisper the same words in the dark. Just one more dream. Because in Shanghai, dreams were all they had, and even those were borrowed from smoke. By the 1910s, Shanghai had become a city of two faces, one wrapped in Western ambition, the other veiled in ancient decadence. The ports were busy with British and French ships, the streets filled with traders, soldiers, and dreamers who came chasing fortune. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the gaslights flickered to life, a different empire emerged: the courtesan's empire, where desire was currency and illusion was law. These women were known as Ming-ji, the brilliant ones, and their world was one of both privilege and peril. Their flower houses stood in the international settlement and French concession, districts carved out by colonial powers who had turned Shanghai into their playground. Inside, everything gleamed: lacquered furniture, embroidered drapes, and mirrors imported from Paris. The courtesans themselves were dressed in the finest silks, their hair pinned with jade combs, their lips painted crimson like wounds beneath candlelight. To the outside world, they appeared powerful, women of mystery who could charm the most powerful men of their age. But their power was fragile, like the porcelain cups they held between trembling fingers. Behind every smile was fear, behind every laugh, exhaustion. The flower house was a stage, and they were its finest actors. The most famous among them became legends. Names like Cai Jianhua and Xiao Fengxian drifted through gossip columns and political whispers alike. These women entertained generals, foreign ambassadors, and revolutionary thinkers. They were said to have influenced treaties, changed alliances, and even softened the hearts of warlords. But such stories were rarely told by them. They belonged to men who turned their lives into myths while forgetting their pain. At the center of it all was opium. The flower houses were not only theaters of pleasure, but also sanctuaries of smoke. Courtesans and their guests reclined on embroidered divans, passing the ivory pipe from hand to hand. The smoke rose like incense in a temple, blurring faces, dissolving reality. In those moments, men spoke truths they dared not utter in daylight, and women forgot, if only for an hour, that they were not free. Opium offered the courtesans control over their image. A dreamy haze softened their voices, slowed their movements, made their presence ethereal. But addiction was merciless. Many began to depend on the drug, not just for escape, but for survival. It dulled the pain of rejection, the loneliness of nights spent pretending to love. It was their secret companion when beauty faded and patrons disappeared. As Shanghai's nightlife flourished, so did its underworld. Tried bosses and smugglers controlled the opium trade, and many flower houses became fronts for trafficking. Some courtesans became intermediaries, using their charm to move information, money, or drugs across the city's invisible borders. Others were victims, caught between the greed of men and the hunger of addiction, and yet, through the danger and deceit, they created an art of survival unlike anything the world had seen. They hosted salons where poets recited verses of longing and scholars debated Western ideas. Their laughter could calm tempers. Their silence could break alliances. They were both prisoners and queens, ruling over a realm built on desire and despair. By the 1920s, their world glittered brighter than ever. But the cracks had begun to show. Modernity was coming, and with it, a new kind of woman, educated, independent, and unafraid. The courtesans watched from behind their curtains as the city changed, knowing that their empire of smoke and silk would one day vanish. For now, though, the music still played and the pipes still burned. The courtesans smiled beneath the haze, their eyes reflecting a truth the city refused to see in a world ruled by men. Illusion was the only power they had left. Beneath the polished marble of London's drawing rooms and the soft murmur of champagne toasts, the true lifeblood of the British Empire flowed, not through veins of gold or coal, but through opium and other narcotics that linked the colonies to the heart of empire. To understand the Victorian aristocracy's hidden indulgence, one had to look east, far beyond Mayfair and Belgravia, to the poppy fields of Bengal and the bustling docks of Bombay. The very substances that lulled the elite to sleep in silk, draped bedrooms were cultivated by impoverished farmers thousands of miles away, forced into labor by imperial decree. Each vial that sat upon a duchess's vanity had a shadow, a chain of suffering stretching across oceans. By the 1850s, Britain's opium trade had become a staggering enterprise. The East India Company, nominally a trading body, was, in truth, a narcotics empire. It monopolized the cultivation of opium in India, regulated its sale, and shipped it by the ton to China, where addiction spread like wildfire. The profits flowed back to London, funding railways, banks, and the lavish lives of the upper class, who rarely questioned where their wealth, or their medicines, came from. Opium wasn't just a vice. It was policy, it was economy, it was empire. Yet the hypocrisy was monumental. Publicly, the Victorians prided themselves on moral purity, missionaries sent abroad to spread virtue and civilization. But behind this facade lay an empire addicted to both the drug and the money it brought. When the Chinese emperor tried to ban opium imports, Britain responded not with diplomacy, but with cannons, the Opium Wars. The message was clear: addiction wasn't just tolerated, it was enforced. And at home, the upper class enjoyed its own refined version of the same poison. While China's streets were filled with the destitute, London's salons were scented with perfumed tinctures of laudanum and morphine. The empire's most elegant exports turned inward. It was as if Britain's soul was split in two, one part preaching restraint, the other consuming itself in quiet luxury. What made the contradiction even more striking was how deeply it was woven into everyday respectability. The British government taxed opium profits. Parliament invested in companies that traded it. Even church endowments were indirectly funded by the same enterprise. The moralists who condemned foreign degeneracy were, unknowingly, beneficiaries of the same poison. In the newspapers, the empire celebrated its conquests, new ports, new markets, new dominions. But it never spoke of the men who died in poppy fields, or the millions in China who wasted away on the drug that funded Britain's grandeur. To question it was to question civilization itself. And so, the hypocrisy deepened. The Duchess who wept over a sermon on virtue might, that very night, take her morphine tonic with trembling hands, her addiction as silent as her country's guilt. Even the language betrayed denial. Opium was never called a drug in respectable homes. It was a remedy, a tincture, a nervous restorative. The empire's destruction of foreign lands was rebranded as trade. Everything dangerous was renamed until it sounded moral. By the late 19th century, however, cracks began to form. Reports from missionaries and reformers returning from the East began to expose the truth, not of the moral corruption abroad, but of the empire itself. They spoke of starving farmers, ruined families, and entire regions turned into fields of addiction for profit. Some members of parliament, disturbed by the revelations, called for reform, but their voices were drowned by the weight of money and denial. The empire's veins ran too deep with narcotic gold to be cleaned, and so the British elite continued to sip from the same poisoned cup, both literally and figuratively. The empire was a mirror of its own rulers, dazzling on the surface, decaying beneath. Behind every jeweled bottle, on a lady's dressing table, lay an empire's sin, an intoxicating empire that built its glory on the quiet suffering of others. It wasn't just addiction to the drug, it was addiction to illusion, to hypocrisy, to the comfort of never having to look too closely at the truth. Because if they did, if they truly saw what connected their luxury to the world's misery, the entire image of the civilized empire would collapse in an instant. By the final decades of the 19th century, the glow of the Victorian elite had begun to flicker. The empire still stretched across continents, but beneath its glittering surface, rot had set in, social, moral, and chemical. The same families who once ruled high society with grace and power now found themselves slipping into a fog of dependency and despair. London's Highborn circles were no longer fueled by ambition or empire, but by morphine, ether, and laudanum, a quiet, genteel decay hidden behind lace curtains and gaslight. The culture of refinement that had once defined aristocracy became its own undoing. Evening parties glimmered with gold and laughter, yet something hollow echoed through the marble halls. The women's eyes, once alive with gossip and wit, now carried a distant glassness. The men, rigid with propriety by day, would stumble home at night, searching for their next draught of escape. The empire's addiction had turned inward, from colonies to castles. By 1880, what had once been whispered in secrecy became harder to conceal. Servants gossiped, physicians worried, newspapers hinted. The opium question was no longer a distant scandal of the East. It was creeping into the heart of Britain itself. The medical community, once complicit, began to shift. New research revealed the dangers of morphine dependence. Doctors who had long prescribed it for every ailment, from nerves to heartbreak, began to see its true grip. They noticed the same pattern among their wealthiest patients: euphoria, tolerance, withdrawal, relapse. And yet, society still refused to face it openly. Addiction was a word reserved for the poor, for the foreign, for the fallen. The aristocracy, after all, did not indulge. It treated its nerves. Even as women grew pale and gaunt, even as men lost their fortunes in opium-induced stupor, the facade held. But not forever. Some of the most striking accounts of this quiet decline came from the diaries and letters of the time. Noblewomen confessing their secret torment between descriptions of tea parties and operas. One wrote of her evening courage, a euphemism for the laudanum she took to endure another night of public performance. Another lamented that she no longer knew whether her affection for her husband was genuine or simply the haze of morphine. Behind every portrait of grace, there was a hidden tremor. Behind every perfectly posed photograph, a pulse that beat too fast. Meanwhile, the younger generation, the heirs to this decaying world, began to see the contradictions too clearly. The empire that had built its fortunes on drugs now found its own elite collapsing beneath the same poisons. The very substances that once symbolized sophistication had become symbols of ruin. By the 1890s, whispers turned into warnings. Social commentators began to speak of a decadent generation. Men and women consumed by artificial pleasures, unable to distinguish reality from illusion. Artists and poets of the aesthetic movement, like Oscar Wilde and his circle, flirted openly with intoxication, not just as vice, but as rebellion. To them, drugs symbolized the ultimate escape from a hypocritical society obsessed with moral appearances. But even this artistic defiance carried tragedy. Many of those who embraced the haze did not return from it. The decline was not sudden. It was slow, graceful, almost beautiful in its tragedy. Aristocratic mansions that once echoed with laughter began to fall silent. Curtains drawn, chandeliers dimmed, and long corridors filled with the scent of medicine and decay. The empire had built its identity on control. Control of colonies, of people, of appearances. Now, it was losing control of itself. Physicians began to withdraw their prescriptions. Reformers spoke in parliament, and the government debated new restrictions on habit-forming drugs. But for many, the damage was done. Generations of dependency had already taken hold. As the century turned, the old world of velvet and venom began to fade. The last of the opium salons disappeared into memory, replaced by new drugs, new scandals, and new forms of escape. But their ghosts lingered, in diaries, in faded portraits, in the melancholy that seemed to haunt every inherited estate. The aristocracy's addiction was more than physical. It was the symbol of a civilization that could not bear to look at its own reflection. A society addicted to illusion, empire, and elegance even as it crumbled from within. And so the story of Victorian refinement ended not with a bang of grandeur, but with a sigh, a soft, narcotic breath that slipped quietly into history. Because sometimes, the greatest tragedies don't happen in wars or revolutions. They happen in silk-covered rooms, under the weight of chandeliers, where beauty dies slowly, one drop at a time.